Good evening. Thank you for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm your host, Dennis Ward. Our guest this week is Ryan McMahon, an Anishinaabe comedian, writer, media maker, and community activator. Well, many of you will know Ryan through his comedy or his documentary Colonization Road. Most recently, he was hosting a 5-part CANADALAND podcast, Thunder Bay, which has received universal acclaim and a lot of downloads. And Ryan, it's a real pleasure here to have you on the show with us this week. And I'd like to start with Thunder Bay because there has been a lot going on. And just wondering, what made you initially want to dig in and do a year-long investigation into what eventually became the Thunder Bay podcast?
Yeah, I was a part of another project called CANADALAND Commons, which is a podcast series about Canadian politics. And, it would seem that week after week, news would break out of Thunder Bay, either, another young person having gone missing or worse, passing away, to, news about the police and the mayor. And it was all of this news. And what we premised our show on was that we were going to do a Canadian politics show that didn't suck. So we started to really think about Canadian politics differently on our show, and we thought, well, no one covers municipal politics unless they're in the city. What if we started to look at municipal politics in Canada? And it just so happens I'm from Treaty 3 territory originally in northwestern Ontario. I grew up going to Thunder Bay, played hockey in Thunder Bay. I have family, friends, and dear colleagues in Thunder Bay. It just so happened that there was a lot of news coming out of there, and when news breaks in Thunder Bay, I pay attention. It's home for me.
Mm-hmm. Was there one thing that happened, though, where you're like, okay, this is it? You talked to the people at CANADALAND and said, we got to dig deeper here? It
was Tanya Talega's seminal work. It was the inquest and the inquest findings. Mm-hmm. But it was actually the afternoon that the inquest report, final report dropped, where the city of Thunder Bay, the report dropped, and about 6 minutes later, the city of Thunder Bay released a press release saying, we are unanimously accepting all 145 recommendations. Mm-hmm. It's like, you didn't have time to read that.
Nor did any of them show up at the inquest.
Right, absolutely. And so that really raised a red flag for me. Not only had they not had the time to really think about what these recommendations might have meant for the city, whether they could afford them, how they were going to pull this off. But I thought, no, you can't silence people. It's not good enough to say, we unanimously accept it, and then the media just goes away and people stop paying attention. I thought, no, this is something. So we set the wheels in motion.
Sounds a lot like the TRC. What was the process? Listening to the making of the podcast was really interesting and insightful. And how long it took for you to build relationships to get people to trust you, I guess, for this podcast?
Yeah, we really tried to. So I'll preface my comments by saying I'm not a journalist. I have so much respect for journalists like you and others. Willow, Jorge, Kenneth Jackson, the team at APTN that really paved the way for me to be able to dig into that coverage, learn about what was happening there, and then find the story, start to connect the dots and find the stories that maybe didn't receive the full attention that they deserve just due to resources. I mean, poor Willow's running around, and I hate to speak for her, but she's running around covering 100 different things. Mm-hmm. Eventually something gets left behind, and we started to look at what got left behind, and before we hit record on any of our recorders and before we jumped in the studio or the recording booth, I spent about 6 months just going to Thunder Bay over and over and over again, connecting with people and talking with people and having them tell me who to talk to next. And when I first accepted the job to make Thunder Bay, the first thing I did is I went home and I talked to my elders, and the first thing they said was just go there and listen, because the people want to talk. They want to tell you about their lives, but you have to listen. And that was a really good lesson for me because, as a creative person, as a writer, as a comedian, it's my job to speak. Yeah. So the exercise in listening was integral.
Well, we're shouting out reporters. Will shout out our mutual friend John Thompson, who is also part of the podcast.
If I could say something about John, not only is he a world-class journalist in Thunder Bay and has done groundbreaking, excellent work in regards to the city and what has gone on over the last couple of years. He's also a gentleman with a really, really forward-looking and kind heart that cares deeply about Thunder Bay and is very open to the criticisms and the celebrations of the city. And he really helped me manage my expectations around, you can't just come here and throw mud on the wall. You have to come here and help us repaint the house. And John Thompson, I'll never be able to say enough good things about John.
I was a reporter in Thunder Bay for nearly 9 years myself and was excited for this podcast when it was announced. But, I also did hear a lot of skepticism. What's Ryan going to bring to the dialogue here? What's going to be new in this? Did you face a lot of skepticism in the time working on this?
I still do, yeah. I mean, absolutely. And this is why I preface my comments. I'm not a journalist. I'm not trying to play a journalist on the internet. I'm a writer. I through my comedy, I've been very privileged and lucky to have been given a platform where people listen to me. And if there's something I can do to amplify the stories or to retell the stories in a way that perhaps they hadn't been told, I'll always jump at that opportunity. And I wouldn't have done it had the people of Thunder Bay, the people of Fort William, the people at DFC at the high school, the people at the RMYC at the youth center hadn't given me access or hadn't given me the right to do it. And so I asked permission first. And I feel good that the people that we worked with very closely on this series granted us and granted me specifically that permission. The risk, of course, is, I'm an Indigenous person that takes this story to a non-Indigenous media company, and they take all the financial risk, they have all the resources and everything else, but I take the personal risk and the creative risk. And I asked a lot of people to trust us, and I asked a lot of people for favors, and so that's always in the back of your mind, trying to make sure that you are doing the best job you can, but that you're doing right by people that are helping you. And that just means that, a lot of people wanted to remain off the record, right. And as you know, as a journalist, that's a problem. You need people on the record, or you don't have a story. So it was about, building the trust to either connect with other people that perhaps people that want to remain off the record would send you to, or leaving that story behind and being willing to move on from that, because perhaps it's not our story to tell. And there are many of those stories that are left behind, that are on the cutting room floor that we didn't tell, and that's the process. We really wanted to do right by the people of Thunder Bay, and by the people that helped us make the show.
And I wasn't trying to be self-serving by mentioning some of the reporters doing really good work there, but they also do face a lot of backlash for this reporting. Is that something that you've faced since the podcast has come out as well?
Absolutely. I think there's a unique challenge to Indigenous journalism, and whether you're doing social impact journalism or whether you're doing hard-hitting investigative stuff, investigating your own people. I was willing to find that Anishinaabe Aski Nation wasn't doing a good enough job transferring these kids into the city and supporting them. I was willing to look at all of the Indigenous organizations in the city, and I looked at that report card that was released after the inquest, and I started to dig into the report card to see who's failing these kids. At the end of the day, I'm not here to protect anyone, and the good thing about being independent and not having a boss is I'm free, so I don't owe anybody anything. And so I also realize that can cause problems, and people don't necessarily want you digging around the edges of their organization. I'm happy to say that we didn't find a lot of blame there. I'm happy to say that what we did find, a lot of people are working really hard inside the city of Thunder Bay this moment to make things better. And so I understand the pressures put on APTN journalists, and I fly the flag of APTN journalists everywhere I go, because I think you inside of this organization have a uniquely troubling responsibility in your job. And we know that there are crooked chiefs, there are crooked councils, there are crooked CEOs. Nobody hates them more than us. We have to live with them, that we're related to them. But to report on them is tricky, yeah, for sure.
We talk about the blowback and the criticism, the skepticism, but this podcast has received nearly universal acclaim, I would say. What's that also been like for you to have so much of your hard work be appreciated the way it has been?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not even fake humble about it. We did this to fight for Indigenous youth. We did this to shine a bright light on a very broken system. And the podcast answers two questions: is the system broken, or is it working exactly the way it's supposed to? And I premise that the system is working perfectly fine. That in fact the system was never supposed to benefit us. And in season 5, we talked about having to land the plane at the end of the podcast and tile this together. And that's what we tried to do is highlight the jurisdictional juggling act that happens between the feds, the provinces, and the municipalities alongside our First Nations. And so we did that in a way that I think is accessible, in a way that a lot of people had never considered before. We did that through storytelling. We did that through connecting bad policy and historical legislation that keeps us firmly planted in poverty and all of the negative social impacts of poverty. And then, on the other hand, we're on the front page of iTunes. We're listed in the best podcasts of 2018. Spotify listed us as the best podcast in 2018. We've received critical acclaim in the United States. That's all good, I guess. Yeah. But really, what we're talking about is we made an impact. I think we made a positive impact overall. And again, we made it to fight for Indigenous youth. So it's cool that you can click on iTunes and see our podcast there, Spotify and other places. But really, this was about Indigenous youth.
Ryan, we just got to step aside for a quick break, and then we'll continue the conversation here on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is comedian, writer, and documentarian Ryan McMahon. And Ryan, we're talking about your 5-part podcast series, Thunder Bay. And I just want to, is there something from the year that you dug into this and the hours of tape that you must have had that really sticks out for you?
For me, there are many voices that stick out, and most of them are youth voices. Again, we get into this loop of dangling youth issues and youth, whether it's youth suicide or youth employment, drugs, alcohol, HIV rates. We get into this loop of dangling them almost like political carrots, and we talk a lot about youth. And I think that leaders often forget to ask youth what they think.
Right.
And they forget to talk to youth. And, we've adopted the slogan, "Nothing about us without us," generally in the Canadian mainstream discourse. I think the same needs to be said with Indigenous youth. If we're talking about Indigenous youth, they have to be at the table. And there were many voices that have really stuck with me in terms of the youth that we talked to. A couple in particular about kidnappings and abductions that they faced, where they were picked up, beaten up, thrown outside of the city to walk back into the city, and not feeling safe enough to report those incidents to police. And having heard a couple dozen of these stories over the year that we investigated, it's hard to hear the police say that, well, there are no incidences of attempted abductions or things like that in the city, because there are none reported. When you actually sit and talk to these youth and listen to them, they'll tell you what they face, and those are the voices that definitely stick with me.
As has been widely reported, even south of the border, 2 recent scathing reports have come out, one about the police service and finding systemic racism, another about the police board and taking away their power as they have not been doing what they need to be doing to alleviate concerns for the Indigenous community. What did you make of those 2 reports?
I think we knew what we were going to find in the OIPRD report. If you ever considered an Indigenous perspective on policing, you knew that you were going to find problematic relationships there, historical broken relationships. I think that was always clear. What wasn't clear were the 44 recommendations. We didn't know what was going to be in those recommendations. I think that that report coming out and saying what it said was a bit of a moral victory for people. However, again, you know, there's no telling whether the Thunder Bay Police are able to meet the requirements that the board or the report recommends, and there's no evidence that they can or will. I mean, you know, one of the recommendations is more cultural sensitivity training, but there's a report in 2016 that said, and I believe it was CBC reported this, there was a cultural competency worker that went into the Thunder Bay Police Services and was laughed out of the room.
Yeah.
And so there's no evidence that these efforts are going to work. I'm not saying that the police in Thunder Bay are destined to fail. I certainly hope that that's not true, but it's something that I think we have to keep an eye on. Senator Sinclair's report was equally damning, and it was a bit of indication for the people in Thunder Bay that, again, have been saying this long ago. I believe almost 30 years ago, there was a call for an inquiry into the police treatment of Indigenous people, and there was a march in Thunder Bay. So for 30 years, Indigenous people in Thunder Bay, in and around Thunder Bay, have been calling for these days to come, and they're finally here. And I suppose now we have to let our foot off the gas a little bit and let these people do their work, and we'll see where the ball lands at the end of the day.
And I think some of that vindication was present when there was a standing ovation for the Ontario Police Watchdog
When do you see standing ovations at press events like that? I mean, I couldn't believe it. And for me, it released a bit of tension. I had to laugh. I thought, boy, as a comedian, I wish I got standing ovations. It's been a long time since I had a standing ovation at a show.
Right.
So to see that, and again, it's a release valve, right? It's like letting the air out of the balloon. And I was getting texts from family and friends that were in that room, and they said that, you know, the tension leading up to it was palpable. The energy in the room during the release of the report and the reading of the executive summary, you know, the energy in there was again, you know, you could cut through it with a knife. And the applause and the standing ovation at the end was testament to the feeling that people were actually heard.
We're talking a lot here about Thunder Bay, but do you think that these types of investigations into the police service and police board could be conducted, maybe should be conducted in other jurisdictions in the country?
I think so. I mean, if nothing else, this is a warning to other police services. This is a warning to other cities of similar size where, you know, perhaps the press is small and that the local media isn't able to cover everything that's going on. I think that Thunder Bay is a warning to Canada, and really, it's Canada's story. And you know, as difficult as it was to make this podcast series, I want to reiterate, and I've said this publicly a lot, and I'll say it again, is that Thunder Bay could have been made in any number of cities across Canada. It just so happens that, yes, you know, you had extortion charges on the mayor, you had extortion charges on the police chief, you had all of these other stories that were really troubling, but there are an equal number of stories about people in northern British Columbia, as we know, on the Highway of Tears. There are enough stories in Saskatchewan and rural Manitoba that, you know, we could replicate this podcast series, and we don't want to, but this is definitely a cautionary tale for Canada. And people that listen to the podcast should understand this, that the City of Thunder Bay, the municipality, is stuck in the middle of this, again, this jurisdictional juggling act that the province and the feds play. And I do hope that one of the outcomes is that more resources make their way to cities like Thunder Bay. We can talk about, you know, the closing of youth centers, how we are quick to axe arts and cultural programming, music programming out of high schools. We need to do a better job generally supporting young people wherever they live.
Thunder Bay, as I was there covering council, and they famously couldn't even get a youth center built with in partnership with the Indian Friendship Center because of people not wanting it in their backyards. I'm going to step aside for another quick break here, Ryan, so we can talk about the importance of podcasts. So we'll be right back here to continue our conversation on Face to Face. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Ryan McMahon. And Ryan, we mentioned how your podcast has been widely praised and downloaded. Connie Walker's award-winning Missing and Murdered, Finding Cleo has been downloaded an incredible 17 million times. Is this an underutilized medium, do you think?
It is, and for those that don't even know what podcasts are, most people go, I don't have an iPod, I can't listen. It has nothing to do with iPods. It's an MP3 file. It's an audio file online that you can play on demand. The medium itself, you press record, you write, you publish when and how you want, with who you want. Respectfully, there's no broadcaster telling you no. Yeah. You get to do it on your own. And so this could be a good tool for Indigenous communities to do work on language. They can do all kinds of things. And it is an underappreciated medium. There are native radio stations all across Indian country. It's our lifeblood. Radio stations are our lifeblood. We divorce our wives on the radio. We sell our stuff on the radio. We find our dogs on the radio. Yeah. And we can tell our stories on the radio too.
What advice do you have to those, perhaps those youth out there looking to start their own podcast?
Just find something you're interested in. The good thing about podcasting is it's all about your niche. Niche doesn't work on TV or in film, but in podcasting it depends on it. And so if you go to the iTunes Top 100 Podcasts right now, or not right now, after we're done, look at the Top 100 Podcasts. There's a knitting podcast that is firmly planted there. It's been there for a decade. So people want to listen to podcasts about knitting. So whatever your niche is, whatever your interest is, that's what will make you successful. And you have to want to talk about it. So find something you love, find something you're passionate about, and the rest will take care of itself.
And I did want to know, have we seen the last of Thunder Bay, the podcast? Is there more to come?
That's to be continued. We'll have a cliffhanger. Yeah. I'll come back in 2019 and let you know. So right now, there are whispers about just keeping track of what's happening. There are no plans for season 2. But we are watching very closely, and there's enough story to tell. Definitely. There's enough on the cutting room floor, so I'll see you in 2019.
Well, it is 2019 with this airing, but that's all right.
Yeah.
There is a lot more to tell, and I mean the whole case with the mayor is still to come before the courts, and I do hope we do have you back for a part 2 to this. That is all the time we do have for today, and a huge thanks to Ryan McMahon for joining us. Go check out the podcast. Check out the documentary, Colonization Road, another great piece of work, Ryan. So really appreciate the work you've been doing. If you have any suggestions for future guests, email us at news@aptn.ca. And, of course, you can find this show and others as a podcast as well. Just head over to our Facebook page, or our APTN News /Face to Face podcast. Thanks for tuning in. I'm Dennis Ward. Have a great night.